So today we're going to be covering the integument. So before we actually talk about the integument very much, let me remind you of a couple of things. Remember we said that we had this pyramid, and these are the levels of organization. And remember down here was cell, and then the next, was chemistry, and the next one was cell, and then where we were last time was tissues. Well, if you go to the next level up, that's the organ level. But we said we were going to skip that level because there's just too many organs in the body. And we were going to go to the organ system. And so that's where we are right now. So today we're going to talk about our first organ system. And basically this is the level we're going to spend the rest of the course at. So we're going to move from one organ system to another organ system and so on, all the way through both courses. But the first organ system we're going to look at is this one, which is the integument. Some of us would call this skin, but technically that's not correct because skin is an organ. And if you look at the integument, there's a lot more than skin in here. If you come down and look at this picture, you're going to see other things in here. There's nervous tissue in here. There's blood vessels. There's hairs. There's all kinds of things that are in here. And so it's not just skin, because skin is an organ, but we have these things like hair and nails and glands and all that sort of stuff, and that makes this an organ system. So let's talk about the integument. So first of all, if you look at the integument, most people may not even think of it as being an organ or organ system, but it is. In fact, it's the biggest one of all of them. Skin is the largest organ in your body. And so depending on how big you are, it's about 16% of your body weight. So look, they took the skin off of this person. This is the skin right here. And so if you fold it out, flatten it out like this and look at it, on an average sized person, it's about 6,000 square inches. And so it's a big, big, big organ. Well, the question pops up is, why do we have skin at all? Think about what our lives would be like if we did not have skin. And so this is what you'd look like over here. And so what would happen is that it would be very, very easy for all kinds of things to happen to you. Bacteria and viruses to get in, fluids to get out, all kinds of stuff like that. So when we talk about the functions of skin, we have to take all that into consideration. And so here is the integument. And like I said, look, it's like lots of things. So it is skin, but there's a bunch of other things in here. Look, those are hairs. There's glands right there, and right here, this is a gland. And then in here, these are touch receptors, so they're part of the nervous tissue. These are blood vessels. And a lot of these are organs in themselves. And so it's not an organ, it's an organ system. So Priscilla says the integument comprises the skin. It's actually the other way around. Skin is part of the integument. So skin is a part, but not all, of the integument. And a lot of people use them interchangeably, and I might even sometimes use them interchangeably, but technically skin is just one part of the integument. The integument has all these other things too, which are not necessarily skin. But let's talk about what the functions of the integument are. So if you look here, you're going to see a list of functions here. We're going to go down them and talk about them individually. But the most important one and the most obvious one, I think, is this one, which is protection. But there's also all of these others as well. So let's look at these functions. And let's start with protection. So first of all, you have to think protection against what? What is it protecting against? Well, what it's protecting against is all sorts of things. One is abrasion, bumping, hurting, that sort of thing. That is one thing it protects us against. But another thing is dehydration. It keeps us from drying out. Another thing it protects us from is bacteria and viruses and so on. And so it's basically just a wall, but it's not just one kind of wall, it's three kinds of walls. So it's really barriers, and there's three different types of barriers. So we have a physical barrier. So the physical barrier is literally like a wall. And so just like the walls in your house, they protect you against what's around the outside. And that's exactly what the skin does, or the integument does as well. We're going to see that there's a chemical, a protein in the skin called keratin. And keratin is the same thing that your hair and your fingernails and things like that are made out of. But it's also in the outer layers of the skin, the outer layers of this integument. And what it does is it keeps water from moving. So in other words, here's the integument, the skin. Water can't enter, but also water can't get out, at least not very easily. So anything traveling with that water is not going to be able to move through the skin. It's going to be repelled. And so if you have bacteria traveling with the water, if you have viruses traveling with the water and so on, they can't get in. It also blocks out a lot of other substances as well. But it's not just a physical barrier, it's also a chemical barrier. In other words, we secrete chemicals onto the surface of the skin, onto the surface of the integument. And one of the things that we secrete onto the skin is acid. So if you look at that and you measure the pH of our skin, it's not 7, it's below 7, it's slightly acidic. So it's acid, and that acid makes it hard for things to grow. And so the bacteria that are on your skin are in contact with this acidic environment, and it inhibits their growth and so on. There are also other secretions which also retard or inhibit bacterial growth. And so it's not just a physical barrier, it's got chemicals on it. It's a chemical barrier. And then it's also a biological barrier. So remember, biology means living. So there's living things in this barrier to make it more effective. Those are mostly things like white blood cells. But there are also things like proteins that are secreted by cells that are antibacterial. So when we look at it, it's a very, very effective barrier. Another thing this does for us is help us regulate our body temperature. So remember, our body temperature is 98.6 ideally, but it doesn't stay there. You start exercising and it'll go up. Well, unless you do something, it's just going to get higher and higher and higher and higher. And if it gets too high, you're going to begin to denature proteins. You're going to begin to kill off cells. So we have to have some way of cooling ourselves. Well, different animals use different strategies for cooling themselves. If you think about a dog pants. Some animals do things like cover themselves in mud, or they find just basically a shade to get out of the sun. What we do is we sweat. And so we actively produce sweat. It's called perspiration or sensible perspiration. And we place it onto the surface of the skin, and when it evaporates, it cools off the body. And so it's the function of this integument to produce this sweat. So we have glands that do that. So there are tons of these glands in the integument that produce this sensible perspiration and cool off the body. Now we can do other things too. We can dilate blood vessels or constrict blood vessels. We can also put on clothes or take off clothes. We can get into the sun and out of the sun. But the part of this that has to do with the integument has to do with these glands, and it has to do with perspiration. So that's another thing. A third thing is, if you think about the skin, the integument is very, very sensitive. We have millions and millions of little nerve endings in our skin. So if you think about just in your fingertip, so you got fingertip here, you have no idea just how many little nerve endings there are here. So there are just tons of them. And so when you touch anything, you're going to activate these nerve endings. And so think about how sensitive your fingertips are. They're so sensitive, people can use them to read with. You can read Braille with your fingertips because that's how sensitive they are. Now, other parts of the body are not quite as sensitive, but they're still sensitive too. But we can pick up all sorts of information. We can pick up temperature, we can pick up touch, pressure, vibration. We can also pick up things like itch and tickle, and then also for sure pain. So we gather a lot of information from the environment through our skin. And then another function of the skin is that it has a metabolic function. Metabolism refers to all the reactions that are going on in our body. Well, some of those reactions produce necessary things for us to live. And one of those necessary things that we have to have is vitamin D. So vitamin D is absolutely necessary. Now you can eat it, and you do eat it every time you eat something like fish or something like that. There's a lot of vitamin D in it. But if you don't eat those things, you have to have some way of producing it. And what it is it happens with something called UV light, and it happens in the surface of the skin. So UV light interacts with products that our cells build and move to the surface of the skin. And it's a three-step process. But in that three-step process, one thing happens at the skin, others happen other places, but we make vitamin D or vitamin D3. We cannot live very well without vitamin D. And so the skin is really, really important for doing that. And then one last thing is we might think of the skin as doing excretion. We think of that being things like the kidneys. Kidneys are excretory organs. And the intestines, because feces come out, those are also excretory organs. But waste products also come out through the skin. They come out in the sweat. And this can be all kinds of things. It can be water, it can be salt. That's pretty obvious, but it can be other things. Think about what happens if you go out drinking alcohol and you drink too much, and then the next day you go to the gym and you start sweating. What do you smell like? Anybody know? That sweat smells just like alcohol. Or if you know people who eat a ton of garlic and then they start sweating, that sweat is going to smell just like garlic and other things as well. So it may not be the most important excretory organ, but it is one. So if we looked at that, that's 5 things that we talked about that the integument is responsible for. Any questions about any of those? Does everybody understand how each of these is a function of the skin or the integument? Okay. Well, let's look at the skin. So if you look at a skin under the microscope, it looks like this. And it's pretty obvious, even without knowing anything, that this does not look like this, which does not look like this. So in other words, there are layers to the skin. There are 3 of these layers. The middle one is called the dermis. And the word dermis literally means skin. So if you go to a dermatologist, it's someone who studies skin. It's the middle part here. Here's the dermis right here. It's the strongest part of the skin. It's got a lot of fibers in it, a lot of collagen, maybe an elastin. It's got a lot of fibers, so it gives the skin its strength and so on. But there's also a layer on top of the dermis. And remember, the prefix for on top of is epi. And so this epidermis or epidermis is on the top. It faces the environment. So it's the one that's going to get hit if you run into something. It's the one the sun is going to beat down on. It's the one that rain is going to hit or anything else. It's this layer right here. And so it has to be adapted for that. It has to be adapted to protect against all those things, against the environment. And then there's a third layer. This layer is not part of the skin, but it is part of the integument. So again, remember, sometimes we use them interchangeably, but they don't really mean the same thing. So this one is not part of the skin, but it is part of the integument. It's called the hypodermis. So hypo means below or beneath. So this is the deepest layer. And if you look at it, it's this layer down here. And I don't know if you recognize this tissue. Maybe you do. Anybody recognize it? It looks a little bit like bubble wrap. It's adipose tissue, that's right. And that's where we're going to find this adipose tissue. And what the adipose tissue does is a bunch of things. It's going to help hold it in place. It's going to attach it to the surface beneath it. But it's also going to provide shock absorbing and that sort of thing. So hopefully when you look at this, even without knowing anything about it, you should be able to just visually see these different layers because they're different tissues. Can everybody see the 3 layers? So how thick are the 3 layers in millimeters? It depends on which part of the body you're talking about. Skin is the thickest along the back, right over the spine, and it's the thinnest right in the front, in the abdomen. So it has thick areas and it has thin areas. This layer also is different depending on which part of the body you're talking about. Now we're going to talk about all that, but think about this. This is very skin thick on the palms of your hands. So your palms have thick skin on them. And that's a good thing because we're constantly using them and rubbing them and abrading them and so on. Also on the feet. So Margarita says that's exactly right. So it's very thick here. And it's thinner everywhere else. But each part of this is variable depending on where you are. Okay, so if we look at the picture, we still should be able to pick out those 3 layers. So look, there's the dermis right there. There's the epidermis right here. And here's the hypodermis down here. Now, there's a bunch of other stuff in here. But for now, we're going to ignore these things. We're not going to talk about glands. We're not going to talk about hairs and stuff like that. We'll come back and talk about them a little bit later on. But for now, we're just going to kind of pretend they're not there. And so what we see here, there's no hairs and no, well, there are glands, but no hairs and stuff like that. So what we're going to look at basically are the tissues that are involved in each of these layers. So we're going to start with this epidermis. So again, on top of. So epidermis is on top of the dermis. Well, again, this is the part that's exposed to the external environment. If we blow it up and look at it, it looks like this. And if you look at the outer rows of this epidermis, they are completely and totally dead. They're dead, dead, dead cells. They're not alive. And so we're all walking around with a layer of dead tissue all over us on the outside. Well, think about this. Why do you think it would be a good idea to have our outer layers completely and totally dead? Why is that a good idea? Well, if it's dead, yeah, you can't hurt it. It's already dead. So you can't injure the cells, just like Johannan says, no cell injury, that sort of thing. If you bump it or rub it off or whatever, it's dead. It's okay, it's dead. It's not until you get through the dead areas till you get to living tissue that you can create a lot of damage. And so that's why it's a good idea for it to be dead. So when we look at the tissue we talked about already. So how can we be sensitive to touch if the receptors are dead too? Well, the receptors are not dead. And they're not really in this layer that we're going to be talking about that is dead. They're just beneath it. So this is the dead part. And around here is where the receptors are. Does that make sense now, Margarita? Yeah. Okay, well, the tissue here, we've already talked about it. We talked about histology. It's stratified squamous epithelium. And remember stratified squamous. Stratified means more than one layer. Squamous means the top cells are going to be flat. Now, that doesn't mean the bottom ones are. The bottom ones are not flat. So the bottom ones look like this, but the higher up you go, the flatter they get. And then remember there's two varieties of stratified squamous. One is keratinized and the other one's non-keratinized. Well, this one is keratinized. So somewhere in here, we're going to start making keratin. And as soon as we start making keratin, remember it's a little bit waterproof, so water cannot go any further up. And that's why these outer rows are going to be dead. So when we look at it, we can actually see that very well. So right here, even though it's hard to see, there's our basement membrane right there. It's this wavy line. And then up here at the very top is our apical surface right here. So the tissue is between these two things. Well, if we look down here, look, we see nuclei and we see big cells. But here, remember, there's not one nucleus. That's the way we tell the two apart. Remember, we have stratified squamous, keratinized and non-keratinized. Non-keratinized would have nuclei up here, but there's no nuclei, none. And so this is keratinized. And we can even see where the keratin begins because that's where the cells die. So the keratin is going to start right along here because above that, it's dead. Well, when we look at this, we can actually see that there are layers in there. Obviously, I think this looks different than this, which looks different than this. There are layers in here. And not only are there layers, there are also different types of cells. So what we're going to find out is there are 4 cell types. And then when we look and see the layers, we're going to see that it can be either 4 or 5, depending on where they are. Layers. So let's look at it. Let's look at the cells first. So if we look at this picture, look, you can see different cells in here. Well, the most common cell in the whole tissue is what's called a keratinocyte. Remember, cyte means cell and keratin. So the keratinocytes make keratin. That's what they do. Well, keratinocytes start out down here at the very bottom. So all of these right here along here, all the way around, almost all of them are keratinocytes. And what's going to happen is they're going to divide. And so when they divide, there's going to be more cells down here. And what's going to happen is some are going to get pushed up this way. And as more cells divide, they're going to get pushed up even further. And as more divide down there, they're going to keep getting pushed up. And eventually what's going to happen is they're pushed all the way to the surface. And then they're going to slough off. We're going to shed those cells. Well, along the way, we're going to make keratin. So they're going to make keratin. And then when they make the keratin, they're actually going to die. The reason why is because they don't get any more nutrition or fluid. And so they're going to die. And when they die, eventually they're going to reach the surface. And then they're going to be shed. Cyte means maintaining cell. That's exactly right, Zoe. But we often use them interchangeably. So I know it's confusing, but you could call this a keratinoblast, but nobody does. Because eventually they're going to die anyway. They're going to turn into these cells that are not really doing anything or they're maintaining. And then they die and then they slough off. So those are keratinocytes. So every one of them is going to start down here. Here's our basement membrane right here. And then, like I said, they're going to get pushed up. They're going to make keratin as they go, and then they're going to die. And then eventually they're going to be shed. They're going to be sloughed off. So most of the cells in here are going to be keratinocytes. And it's about 95%. So about 95% of the cells are keratinocytes. But not all of them. We also have these cells. You can see here, these cells, they're called Langerhans cells. And Langerhans cells are not keratinocytes. They do something completely different. Langerhans cells are white blood cells. Now, a better name for them is called epidermal macrophages. Langerhans cells, Langerhans was a person. And we used to have lots and lots of things named after a person, after people. But we're getting away from that, so the names are slowly being changed. So eventually, Langerhans cells are just going to be called epidermal macrophages, which is a much better name because it tells you what they do. They're in the epidermis, they're epidermal, and then they're macrophages. And macrophage, that word means big eater. Macro means big, and phage means to eat. So a phage eats a lot of stuff. And what they eat is things that's not supposed to be there. So what they do is they roam around through here, looking for things that aren't supposed to be there. They're modal. They can crawl in between these other cells. And when they find something like a bacterium or a virus or even something like a splinter or something, they eat it and they destroy it, help get rid of it. They also eat damaged and dead skin cells as well in these layers. So, Langerhans cells. And then we have another kind of cell which are called Merkel cells. So Merkel cells are only down here on the bottom. So here's our basement membrane right here. And here's a Merkel cell right there. That's a Merkel cell. And Merkel cells are special cells. Now they never move, they stay here on the bottom. But Merkel cells have a little nerve ending that's connected to them. So here's a little nerve ending right here. And so what Merkel cells do is they act like touch receptors. So they receive light touch. That's what they detect. So if something just barely brushed against your skin and you felt it, that would be these Merkel cells. Light touch. And then the last kind of cell that we have are these down here. They also don't move. They stay down here on the bottom. These are called melanocytes. So remember, keratinocytes make keratin. Melanocytes make melanin. And melanin is a colored pigment. It has color to it. And it's what gives your skin its color, whatever your skin is. So it could be tan, it could be brown, it could be black. Whatever that color is, it's due mostly to these melanocytes. And so even when we look at this picture here, you can see color here. That's what that brown that you see is. So this person's skin is going to have a lot of this color. And when you look at it from above, because there's so much of this color, they're going to have that coloration or that skin tone. Here's some more melanocytes. And again, you can see the color. You can see the color here. Any questions? So 4 different types of cells. So this one, remember, the most common, 95%. The other 5% is mixed up of all of these. Remember, these make keratin and they get pushed up and they slough off. They're the only ones that are sloughing off. They're the only ones that shed. These, remember, they roam around looking for things that aren't supposed to be there. Both of these stay down right next to the basement membrane. They don't move at all. So Johannan says in albinos, are the melanocytes absent or no pigment is formed? They have melanocytes, but what happens is, in order for the melanocyte to make this melanin, there's an enzyme involved. And the enzyme is coded for by your DNA. The enzyme is called tyrosinase. And what tyrosinase does is it converts an amino acid which you eat, which is called tyrosine. It converts that to melanin. So our DNA has the information about how to make this enzyme. So in an albino, the DNA information is faulty. So when they go to make the enzyme doesn't work. It's faulty. So if you have a faulty enzyme, you can't convert that to melanin, so they have no melanin. that make sense, Johanna? Okay, so here's our tissue. So remember, it's stratified squamous, keratinized, and it goes from here to here. And so what we're going to see is it has layers, and you can see these layers right here even without really knowing anything about it, because this does not look anything like this, which doesn't look anything like this, and so on. Same thing here. Here's our basement membrane right here. The top part's off the scale, but it's up there. But in here you can see layers. So we're going to talk about those layers. Before we do that, though, let's spend a little bit more time talking about melanocytes. So I already said, remember, it's this enzyme. There's the enzyme. And again, albinos lack this enzyme. It's a faulty enzyme. But it's controlled by our DNA. And so our DNA can make different enzymes depending on who our parents were and what genes we have. And so we can have different forms of melanin. Again, it's controlled by your DNA. But there are 3 forms of melanin. So we have melanin that's called eumelanin, and U means true is what it means. So true melanin. And true melanin is brown, or it can be so brown that it's black. And so browns and blacks are made by eumelanin. Now, depending on how much of this you can have, that brown can be like tan, or it can be like cocoa colored, or it can be, you know, jet black, just depending on what it is. But they're all browns and blacks. But there's another kind of melanin too, and this is called pheomelanin. And pheomelanin is not brown or black, it's red. It's red in color. And so if you see someone who has red hair or any other thing to do with red, their skin is also different. But that's a different kind of melanin. But it's still the melanocytes that make both types of melanin. And so let's look a little bit more at these melanocytes. So we know they're down here on the bottom, and we know they make this melanin. This is what they look like. Look, they look like spiders, or maybe an octopus. They have arms. So here's the arm, and here's the arm. And what they do is they make this melanin. They sit right here on the basement membrane. They don't move, and they make melanin. And so the melanin, there it is down here. Here's our basement membrane. What's going to happen is, you can see the arms here. There's some arms and arms like that. And then here's where that melanin is. Well, I would say that this is eumelanin because look how dark it is. It's not red in color. It's almost black. And here's what happens. They make this melanin and then they package it. And the little packages are called vesicles. So here's a vesicle full of melanin. And these vesicles are released. And then what happens is the keratinocytes absorb the melanin. Look, this keratinocyte has absorbed this little package. This little vesicle, it's called a melanosome. And look, it's a package of melanin. And then what's going to happen is this little melanosome is going to disintegrate. It's going to break. And the melanin gets released. And so the melanin spreads out throughout the cell. And so what's going to happen is our keratinocyte is going to change color. It's going to become the color of this melanin. But keratinocytes don't make the melanin. Remember, melanocytes make the melanin. What they do is they absorb it. But then what's going to happen to these keratinocytes, remember, is they're going to move up and move up and move up. And eventually they're going to be shed. And when they're shed, all of that melanin that goes with them is going to go out too. So here's our melanocyte down here. Well, it kind of begs the question of why do we have melanin? Why have it? Well, it has to do with UV light. So UV light comes from the sun, and UV light penetrates our skin. And as it penetrates the skin, if it hits a nucleus, it causes damage to that nucleus and damage to that cell. And over a period of time, the more this happens, the damage builds up. And eventually that damage can cause all kinds of things. It can cause wrinkling, but it can cause a lot worse things too, like cancer and so on. So if we look at what happens, this penetrates very easily. But what happens here is the melanin absorbs the UV light. It absorbs it. So melanin is sort of like a natural sunscreen. And the more melanin you have, the more of this you're going to absorb. And it's not going to get down in here and damage the tissues. So the reason we have melanin is to absorb this UV light and to prevent damage. So these cells react to UV light. So when the UV light comes in here and it hits this cell, the melanocyte is going to up its production of melanin. So think about the different times of the year. So if you look at winter, how much sunlight is there in the winter? A lot or a little? How much sunlight is there in the winter? A lot or a little? Days are short, remember? There's only a little. So how much stimulation is this melanocyte going to get in the winter? Less stimulation. And if there's less stimulation, what's going to happen to the melanin production? Less melanin. And so these cells which are absorbing it are going to have less to absorb. And so these cells are not going to be as dark. And so if you look at a person in the winter, their skin is lighter in color because there's less UV light, less stimulation, less melanin. But then what happens in the summer? In the summer, the days get longer, the sun gets more intense, it comes through here. What's going to happen to this? We're going to increase the stimulation of these cells. We're going to increase melanin production. And so these are going to have more melanin to absorb, and so they're going to get darker. And so if you look at summer skin, it looks like this. And that's exactly why people get a tan, or they get darker in the summer. But how long does a tan last? It doesn't last very long. Get out of the sun completely. What's going to happen is all of these cells, remember, they're going to keep getting pushed up, pushed up, pushed up, and these darker cells are going to slough off. and your skin is going to get lighter again. But as soon as you go back out in the sun, we're going to stimulate these melanocytes. They're going to make more melanin. Keratinocytes are going to absorb it. The skin's going to get darker again. Does that make sense to everyone? So Johannan says, can you tell us why melanin is used for jet lag? No, that's not melanin. That's a hormone called melatonin. Melatonin. They're two different things. They sound alike because they both have to do with UV light. But melanin is a pigment. That's what makes your skin have color. This is a hormone. It comes from a gland in the brain called the pineal gland. When you get to AMP2, we'll talk more about this. Or even in this course toward the end when we get to the brain. But anyway, so does everybody understand melanocytes and melanin and all that, and why we get darker and why we lose that tan and all those kinds of things? Any questions about it? Well, remember this. Why can you get darker? We get darker because UV light stimulates this melanocyte. Melanocyte makes more melanin. More melanin gets absorbed by these keratinocytes. And so the keratinocytes get darker. And so if all the keratinocytes get darker, the skin is going to get darker. So if you get under a sun lamp, if you go to a tanning booth, well, the sun lamp has UV light in it, and that's what happens. It stimulates these cells. So we get a tan. But you stop going to the tanning bed, you stop stimulating it, then you're going to lose the tan. Okay, but remember this UV light. So we're trying to keep it out by making this melanin. And so we darken the skin up here so that it's like a natural sunscreen. Because when it gets through here, it damages cells. Well, there are actually two forms of UV light. And they're slightly different in their wavelength. There's UVA. And UVA tends to penetrate the skin a lot deeper. So look, it goes down into the dermis and down into the hypodermis. Also UVB. UVB tends to stay in the top part of the skin. In this epidermis, it does not get down deep. And so the damage that we see from these depends on the type of UV light it is. So damage from UVB happens up here in the surface areas, and this is what gives us a sunburn. So if you've ever had a sunburn, what happens is you basically destroy these cells at the top. And think about what happens after a sunburn. It peels off. Those tissue layers up in the top peel away. But UVA, we don't notice it very much, and UVA penetrates much deeper. We don't get a burn. What we get are all of the things that we associate with aging. So we get things like wrinkling and age spots and things like that. That's what we get from UVA. So if you look at someone's skin after they've been subjected to this, you can see it. So here's UVB. Remember, it tends to stay in the epidermis, and here's UVA, and it tends to go much deeper. And it has to do with the wavelength. So look at this. This is just the the distance between the waves. And so this has a short, or a longer wavelength. And a long wavelength means less energy. So look, it does not penetrate as far because there's less energy. But this has a shorter or longer wavelength. It goes deeper. So we get more damage. And look at this. If you take a picture with this is a thermal camera. And here's a person, you just see what they look like. But there's skin damage all in this person's skin from this UVA and UVB. And with this camera, you can see it. See that little mark right there? It's actually a lot of damage, but there's also damage in lots of other places as well. If you look here, all of these little white spots that you see, that's skin damage. Even though they're not very visible over here, you can see them here. And here you can see this skin damage. Look at this guy here. This picture is not photoshopped. It's not been touched up in any way. Look at this picture. And look at the two sides of this guy's face. Well, the reason it's like this is because this guy was a truck driver. He was a truck driver for 38 years. And think about this. He's been riding around 38 years. In the US, we sit on the left side of the car. Here's the steering wheel, and here he is sitting right here. And the sun streams in like this. So this side of his face is exposed. But the other side is dark. There's no light coming in this way, so look at the right side of his face. That is the most dramatic thing I can show you that shows you what skin damage looks like. Look at all of this wrinkling that this guy has over here, and there's hardly any of it over here. Well, if I were to take this picture and split it in half, and then show you what the face would look like if it was just this side, and show you what the face would look like just this side, it looks like this. So look, if he had no sun for his 38 years, this is what he would look like. Look, hardly any wrinkles at all. But this side, if he spent his whole life, 38 years in the sun, this is what he would look like. Now, if this doesn't make you want to stay out of the sun, nothing is going to make you want to stay out of the sun. Same thing's true for tanning beds. This guy would be the one who used the tanning bed. And this guy would be no tanning. Does that make sense? Any questions? So, let's review just a little bit. Here are layers we saw. We haven't talked about them yet, but remember we have 4 different types of cells. So he says, so sunscreen wouldn't have. Well, sunscreen acts like melanin. So when you put sunscreen onto your skin, instead of it being melanin here, it's a chemical, but the chemical is absorbed into the skin just like this. And what it does is it absorbs the UV light. So it acts like this, but your skin doesn't change color. So if we go back to this guy, this is almost like he only put sunscreen over here. And he put no sunscreen over here. So yes, sunscreen helps. because what it does is it prevents the UV light from getting down into the skin, and so it prevents this damage that we see. Does that answer your question, Zoe? Okay, so like I said, let's review these cells real quick. Remember, we had 4 types. Keratinocytes, the most common. So this is a keratinocyte. This is a keratinocyte. That. All of these are keratinocytes. About 95% of all these cells are going to be keratinocytes. Remember, they're going to start out down here. They're going to get pushed up, and they're going to make it all the way to the surface. As they go, they're going to make keratin, and then eventually they're going to die, and they're going to slough off. They're going to be shed. And then here's a Langerhans cell right here. So Langerhans cells, remember, can crawl in between and around these other cells looking for things that aren't supposed to be there. Here's a Merkel cell down here, and there's that nerve ending that's right next to it. So remember, this acts like a touch receptor for light touch. And then here's our melanocytes right here and right here with their weird arms, and they're making this melanin, which is going to be absorbed by these keratinocytes. And so again, if you look at the slides, you should be able to, maybe not without help, but you should be able to figure it out when they're labeled, these different cells. Okay, but not only do we have 4 cell types, remember we also have layers. And there are layers, and you can count them. But depending on where you are on the body, it's either 4 or 5 layers. If it's 4, we call it thin skin. If it's 5, we call it thick skin. Another thing is, thin skin, when there's only 4, that's the kind of skin where we find hairs. So thin skin is also called hairy skin. Where we have 5, remember, that's thick skin, and there are no hairs. So this is also called non-hairy skin. Now remember, we're only talking about the epidermis. So look, if we peel off the epidermis like this is what we're talking about. So this is where we're going to see either 4 or 5 layers. And here, they've done that. There's thin skin, and here is thick skin. And so if we blow this up, what we should be able to see in here is 4 layers. And what we should be able to see in here is it has an extra layer. There's 5 layers. Also, this outermost layer, which is pretty obvious, is much, much thicker in thick skin. So let's look at these layers. Now this is a model that we have for the lab, and we're going to see this again when we do the lab even online. But look, here are hairs. So this is hairy skin, and hairy skin is thin skin. This, there's not one hair at all, none anywhere. That's thick skin. Well, we have hairy skin, thin skin, basically everywhere on our body, everywhere, except on the palms of our hands and our fingertips, and the soles of our feet and our toes. And that's where we have thick skin. And it's the only places we have thick skin: palms of the hands and soles of the feet. So if we look at it, here's our picture we saw before. We can see layers. And here's a layer right here. That's this one. And here's a layer right here. That's this one. And here's a layer. Look, it's dark, and we can see it here. And then here's this layer. That's this one. Well, the layers are called strata. That's all strata means, is layers. And then they're named for what's there. So if we start at the bottom, at the basement membrane, the layers are Stratum Bissau, basal, bottom, Stratum Bissau, Stratum spinosum, Stratum granulosum, and Stratum corneum. Well, if we look at these words, Bissau means bottom or basal. Spinosum means prickly. So we're going to see that the cells look prickly. Granulosum means granules. And so these cells have little granules in them. You can see them really easily. And then corneum means horn-like. So it's tough, like a horn. So there's our basement membrane. So here's our Bissau, spinosum, granulosum, corneum. Can everybody pick out the layers? Look, this layer does not look like this layer. And this layer obviously doesn't look like this layer. And that layer doesn't look like any of them. So 1, 2, 3, 4 layers. So that's our thin skin. If you look at thick skin, it has the same layers, but it has an extra layer. And that extra layer is right here. It's right here. That's the extra layer. And it's called the Stratum Lucidum. And lucidum means clear. So when we look at it, let's see that white line, it looks clear. So if we look at it under a microscope, here's our basement membrane. So look, there's this layer, which does not look like this layer, which does not look like this layer. And then look, there's this clear layer right here, and then that layer. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But it goes Bissau, basal layer, spinosum, spiny layer, granulosum, granular layer, lucidum, clear layer, and corneum, layer that's like a horn, horn-like. Everybody pick them out? One last time, there's the basement membrane. So here's a layer, here's a layer, here's a layer, here's a layer. Same thing here. Here's our basement membrane. So here's a layer, here's a layer, there's a layer, and then we got this extra one right there, and then this one. Well, let's talk about the layers. So remember, we're going to start with the bottom. This is the Stratum Bissau. So if you look at the Stratum Bissau, it's the deepest layer. So here's our basement membrane right here. And so it fits right on top of that basement membrane. It's only one row of cells, just one row. Well, up here is epithelial tissue. Remember, it's stratified squamous. And epithelial tissue has no blood vessels. No blood vessels. So there's no nutrition up here except what it can get from another layer. The blood vessels are here. They're down here in this layer. And so what it is this Stratum Bissau, which sits right on top of it. It gets all of the nutrition just about, because it's the closest one to the blood vessels. And so this is the healthiest layer. It's very close to the blood supply, very healthy, and it's also very active. It's constantly going through mitosis. In other words, the cells are constantly dividing. So this layer is actually going to make or create all the layers, because as they divide, the cells are going to get pushed up. And so we're going to create those other layers. The cells that we have here are mostly keratinocytes, but this is also where the melanocytes and the Merkel cells are. If we go back to our picture, oops, too far. Here's that layer right here. And here's the cells that are dividing. Look, you can see mitosis happening right there. And here's our melanocytes. And here's our Merkel cell. And here's our keratinocytes. That's what we have in this layer. So we have keratinocytes, melanocytes, and Merkel cells. Well, if we look at this, we can see this layer right here. Remember, it's only one row of cells, so it's just a thin, thin, thin layer. But right there, remember again, here's where the blood vessels are, down here. So it's really close to the blood vessels. And again, we're going to have melanocytes, keratinocytes, and Merkel cells down here. These keratinocytes are going to divide constantly. They're going through mitosis. So they're going to get pushed up, and they're going to create these other layers. So the next layer up is the stratum spinosum. Spiny or prickly is the name of it. And the reason why is because the cells change shape. In the Bissau, they look like this, but in the spinosum, they look like this. They look prickly. What makes them look prickly is they have these little sort of connections which look like buttons. They're called desmosomes. And so when we look at it, here's the layer right here. It goes from here to here. Over here, from here to here. And again, the cells have a prickly look to them because they have all these like little buttons. And at every button, there's a little bit of an angle to it. Maria, I don't know the answer to that. I can look at it later, but I can't do anything about it right now. But look over here at these cells. See all these little dots you see? Those are those little buttons, those desmosomes. And another thing that happens is spaces get created between the cells. And so what we have here are these keratinocytes but we also have Langerhans cells. And Langerhans cells can crawl in between these cells in these little spaces that are created. So when we look here, what we have are these melanocytes with these desmosomes, and then we have Langerhans cells crawling in between. This is also the layer where the keratinocytes absorb the melanin and they change color. Okay, and then the next layer is called the stratum granulosum, or the granular layer. So we go from having these cells that look prickly like this, they start building something, and what they build is something called keratohyalin. And keratohyalin is in these granules, little granules, and they absorb stain. So the cell starts looking granular. And you can see it, they stain very darkly. It looks like this. Here's that layer right here. Here's the layer. So right there is where we're going to have those granules. This is the granular layer. Again, what it's making is something called keratohyalin. And keratohyalin is the first step in making keratin. And so this layer becomes a little bit waterproof. So it's waterproof, which means water cannot pass through it. So if we look at the next layer, look, every single one of these cells has died, and everything in that cell falls apart. So there are no nuclei. And so we get the clear layer, the stratum lucidum. And the reason it's clear is because that keratohyalin gets converted to elidin. So we go from keratohyalin, which is dark staining, to elidin, which doesn't pick up any stain at all. And so it looks transparent, or it looks clear. So you go from dark and grainy to clear. Also remember, the cells are going to die. So now the cells are dead. And so when we look at it, this is what we see, this clear layer. And then the last layer is the stratum corneum. Remember, the word corneum means horn-like. Cornu means horn. If you've ever heard of cornucopia, it's a horn of plenty. Cornu means horn. So it's the horny layer, or horn-like layer. So what we have here are keratinocytes. They're completely and totally dead, and they're full of keratin. So we went from keratohyalin, and remember it got converted to elidin, and then elidin gets converted to keratin. And keratin is the protein that gives our skin its toughness and its resistance to abrasion and all those things. So it makes it very strong and very tough, but it also, remember, is dead. These cells are completely and totally dead. So if you look at this layer, that's this one here, and it's the thickest layer by far. And it's full of these dead, keratinized cells. And then look what happens. We went from here to here. We made this keratin, the cells died, and eventually look what happens. They slough off. We shed them. So we're constantly shedding skin. The average person loses about 66,000 skin cells per minute. And over your lifetime, the average person loses about 120 pounds of skin cells. And so it comes off and it goes into the environment. It goes into your clothes, it goes into your carpet. If you take a bath, it goes into the bathtub. It makes house dust. That's what it is. Any questions? Can everybody pick out the layers? So again, there's Bissau, 1 row of cells. Spinosum, about 8 to 10 rows of cells. Granulosum, 3 to 5. Lucidum, 3 to 5. And then corneum, several hundred. Any questions? So look at this. Is this thick or thin? Which one do you think it is? Thick or thin? How do you tell them apart? How many layers does thin have? 4. How many layers does thick have? 5. So look, 1, 2, 3. Here's that one that's extra. 4, 5. So this is thick skin. That's what you're going to have to do, is you're going to have to count layers. Any questions? So, again, Bissau, spinosum, granulosum, lucidum, and corneum. The estra is so thin it's hard to tell it apart. I'm not sure what you mean by estra. Oh, extra. It's right here. There it is right there. You see it now? It's a different color. It's not purple. It's clear. It starts over here. It goes like this. Everybody see that clear layer? The lucidum. I take the line back off. Now can you still see it though? So that's the dermis. I see it when you point it out. Well, things are always easier when somebody points them out. But look, so here's 1 row, and then here's something different, and here's something different, and then here's something different, and then that. But it goes from there to there, from there to there. Okay, so this is the epidermis. So the epidermis is stratified squamous keratinized. That's what we were just looking at. But look, down here is the dermis. And that's a different kind of tissue. It's completely different. Look, it does not look like this other tissue. So the dividing line right here is easy to see because it completely looks different below. So let's look at this dermis. So dermis, remember, is the middle layer. And it is not epithelial tissue, it's connective tissue. And we talked about different connective tissues. Well, this one is both areolar and dense, irregular connective tissue. And there might even be a tiny bit of adipose tissue in here. But what it mostly is dense, irregular. And so if we look at it, it looks a little bit like this. So there's our line right there. And we're going to come down to about right here. And so that's the dermis. And so if we look at it here, there's our line. And we're going to come down to about here. So there's the dermis. Well, you can see that the dermis itself has layers. It has two. There's one layer called the papillary layer. Papillary comes from the word papilla. And papilla means nipple. So what we're going to see are some things that look like nipples on this layer. And then the other one is reticular. And reticular comes from the word reticulum, which remember means network or a net. And what we're going to see is a net of fibers. Well, if we look at this picture, you can kind of see the difference. Up here looks different than down here, but you can see it better here. So look, this is different than this. So here's the papillary layer. And the reason, again, it's called that is because of papillae. So they look like nipples. So if we look at the top of this layer, you see these nipple-like projections that go up like that. So each of these is called a papilla. And so the layer where the papillae are is the papillary layer. And then down here, look at all these fibers. And they form like a net down here. Now they're thick fibers, they're collagen, but it's still sort of a net, and so it's called the reticular layer. So let's look at the papillary layer first. So again, we're going to have these papillae, these dermal papillae. And so if we look at them, we can see them here. If we looked on the model, I have a picture of that. It was stuck for some reason. Okay. I guess I don't have it. Anyway, when we get to the lab part, we'll have it. But that's a papilla. So if we were to blow it up, there it is right there. There's a papilla. So if we look over here, there's a papilla. And there's another papilla right there. And here's another one. That's a papilla. Well, what you have inside the papilla are blood vessels. So there are little tiny blood vessels in here. And the tissue that's in here is areolar. So there's a papilla right there. And there's another one right there. So the tissue that's in here is this. It's areolar or areolar connective tissue. Remember areolar, we have the ground substance. It's like jelly. And then we have all three types of fibers. There's collagen, and there's elastin, and here are the reticular fibers. And then the cells here are fibroblasts because they make these fibers. So that tissue right there is areolar. And areolar connective tissue is soft. It's shock absorbing. And so this is what gives your skin its softness. So if you look at some people, they have a thicker papillary layer than others do. Females tend to have a thicker one than males do. And babies have a much thicker one than adults do. So if you touch a baby's skin is very, very, very soft. And again, it's because of this layer here. Well, look up here. Here's our epidermis. You should be able to pick out the strata here. There's one right there. That's the Bissau. Here's our spinosum, granulosum, and corneum. This is thin skin. But we're looking down here. And that's the tissue that's here. So that's this part right here. Well, if you look in this picture, you'll see these little weird looking things right here and right here. If you take and blow that up and look at it for real, it looks like that. These are called Meissner's corpuscles. And Meissner's corpuscles detect light touch. So not light touch. Remember, that was Merkel's. It takes a little bit more energy, more pressure to activate these. But it's still light touch. So if you were to look at what one of those looks like, here's a nerve ending. And at the end of the nerve, it has a capsule around it like this. So there's a nerve ending in here. And here's the capsule that's around it. So we have a ton of these Meissner's corpuscles, especially in thick skin. So if we look in thick skin, remember thick skin is found on the palms of the hands, the soles of the feet, your fingertips. So if you were to look at your fingertips, here are those papillae. There are just tons of these things in here. And so our fingertips are really, really, really sensitive. So we have this areolar connective tissue. Remember, areolar has all three types of fibers. So we have collagen, and we have elastin, and we have the reticular fibers. We have these dermal papillae. That's why it's called a papillary layer. And inside those dermal papillae, we have these little blood vessels. We also have these Meissner's corpuscles. And again, those detect light touch. We also have some naked nerve endings, free nerve endings. And free nerve endings or naked nerve endings detect things like chemicals. And so they produce the sensation of itch. So that's the papillary layer. It's about 15% of the total of the dermis. Let's look at the reticular layer though. The reticular layer is this one down here. It's about 80 to 85% of the total. And it's a completely different kind of tissue. There it is down here, and you can see these fibers. Look at it here, and you can see fibers. And they're running every which way. So this is not areolar. This is dense, irregular connective tissue. It's dense, irregular. So not this up here, that's the papillary layer, but down here, this layer down here, where you have all these collagen fibers. Remember, collagen stains pink, and you can see these thick fibers down here. So, it's dense, irregular. Now there's also some elastin here, so it has some stretch, but this layer is what gives your strength, your skin its strength. This is the strong part of the skin. So if you think about your skin can be pulled on, tugged on, all kinds of stuff, and it doesn't usually tear. Now, if you pull it hard enough, it can tear. But the reason why is because of all of these collagen fibers. There's just tons of this collagen. And remember, they're running every direction. That's why it's called dense, irregular connective tissue. Again, you can see all of these collagen here. Now, there's also some elastin, but not as much. But this is dense, irregular connective tissue. So, we go back here. Dense, irregular. We have also some elastin. And then there's another kind of receptor here. These are called Pacinian Corpuscles. So if we look at this picture, you can see these things down here. They look a lot like an onion that's been cut in half because they have layers like this. Layers on top of layers. They look like an onion. And Pacinian corpuscles, what they detect is pressure. So there's it is. And if you look at it for real, this is it. Look at all these layers that you see. Layer, 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 just like the layers of an onion. And so again, this is an encapsulated nerve ending. So you have a nerve ending this way. And then instead of having one layer like you do with these over here, we have many, many, many layers. And this is a Pacinian corpuscle. So that's here. And again, they don't detect touch, they detect pressure. Any questions? So, that's the dermis. Well, if you look at this dermis, it's not smooth everywhere. Like if you think about your fingertips, they're not smooth. If you look at your fingertips, they look like this. In other words, they're like this. And what it is the dermis down here every so often is pushing up. And so it pushes the epidermis up to form these ridges. Well, that's what our fingerprints look like. Think about fingerprints. Why do you think we have fingerprints? Is it so the cops can catch you if you do something bad? Is that why we have fingerprints? Anybody want to guess why we have them? It's actually for gripping. So if you want to pick up a dime or something like that, if you have these friction ridges, that's what fingerprints are, you get a better grip. Not only do we have friction ridges, but we also have these things, which are called cleavage lines. And we also have these things, which are called flexure lines. So depending on where you look at the skin, you see very different things. So altogether, these things are called dermal modifications. So we have friction ridges on our fingertips. And again, they're all about grip. And they form these things called fingerprints. Well, if you look at them, remember they're ridges, and at the top of every ridge is the opening to a sweat gland. And so there's sweat that comes out of these things. And so anytime you touch anything, you leave a little layer of sweat. And there's salt and proteins in sweat, and so when it dries, you leave a fingerprint. Well, every individual person has a unique fingerprint. Even identical twins have different fingerprints. They're unique because they're a combination of both DNA, but also what happened to you over your lifetime, the environment. Here's another interesting thing. Have you ever noticed what happens when you get in water? What happens to your skin? It prunes up, but it doesn't prune up everywhere. It only prunes up on your fingertips. Well, some people think that's because water gets into your skin, or some people think it's because water comes out of your skin. That's not it at all. It's actually a physiological mechanism. Your nervous system makes this happen. So your nervous system actually creates these little pruning things. And basically what it is your fingerprints got bigger, like this. So there's bigger ridges. And bigger ridges give you a bigger grip. So think about it. If your hands are wet, things are slicky, it's going to be hard to grip onto things, but this improves your grip. The reason I have this picture in here is look at this person's finger right here. This person soaked their whole hand in water. And look what happened here and here and here. The finger's pruned, but here there was no pruning. And that's because the nerve going here in this person's hand was cut. So the nervous system could not tell the skin here to prune. So there's no pruning. Does it make sense to everyone? Here you can see a close-up of that. Look at that. Doesn't look like this person has been in water at all. But here it does, and here it does. Okay, we also have these cleavage lines. And cleavage lines look like this. And what it is the direction most collagen fibers are going. So most of the collagen fibers are following these little lines. And look, the lines are different depending on where you look. If you looked at the face, look at it here. Cleavage lines vary tremendously. Well, why do we worry about this? Well, in medicine, we worry about it because of what happens with healing. If you get a cut or an incision or something like that across cleavage lines, what happens is the wound tends to gape open. And even if you get stitches, it's still going to gape open in between the stitches. And so here's a stitch, it's going to be closed, but there's going to be a little gap, closed, a little gap, closed. And what's going to happen is your body is going to fill the gap in with connective tissue. And so what you're going to get is a scar. But if you cut yourself or make an incision parallel to the cleavage lines, what happens is the wound tends to close on its own. So even if you don't get stitches because the walls are right next to each other, there's no gap in between, there's no place to fill in anything, And so you get minimal scarring. And so if you do surgery on someone, we're creating these incisions. Well, if you want to minimize the scarring, you need to pay attention to these cleavage lines so that you know the directions that the incision should be made. It's especially true if you go into something like cosmetic surgery. Because in cosmetic surgery, the idea is to minimize that as much as you possibly can so that there is no scar. We also have flexure lines. So if you look at your hand, everybody look at your hand, you're going to see where your fingers bend, where your wrist bends, where your elbow bends, where anything bends, we're going to wind up with flexion lines. We're going to get creases. If you look at a baby's hand, they haven't done a lot of this, and they have very, very small, or they're absent, these flexion lines. Any questions about these dermal modifications? Okay, let's look at one more and then we're going to stop for today, and that is the hypodermis. So remember, the hypodermis is not part of the skin, but it is part of the integument. But it's not skin. It's what holds the skin on. And so a lot of times it's called the subcutaneous layer. And what it mostly is adipose tissue. Now, it also has some areolar, but it's mostly adipose tissue. And if you remember adipose tissue, it looks like this. So here are those adipocytes. And remember, adipocytes, they start out as normal-looking cells with a nucleus and everything, but as they get bigger, what happens is the nucleus and the cytoplasm get pushed over to the side, and the rest of the cell gets filled up with fat. And they get even bigger, and it even gets pushed even further over to the side, and then the rest of the cell is filled up with this fat. And that's exactly what we see here. So remember I said it looks a little bit like bubble wrap, but it's not air that's in there, it's fat. And so a better way of thinking, instead of like bubble wrap, think of bubble wrap with water in the bubbles or fat in the bubbles. So these are like water balloons or fat balloons. And so they're soft and they're squishy and they're shock absorbing. And so this hypodermis protects all of these underlying tissues. So there's muscle down here and there's bone down here and so on. And if you get hit really hard like this, this spreads out the shock so that it doesn't damage the underlying tissue as much. But because it's fat, it's also where we store energy. So there's a lot of energy storage in here. It's also, remember, insulating. So this helps keep heat from moving from our body and leaving it or entering it. And so it has a bunch of different functions. This is quite variable in how thick it is. It just depends on how much body fat a person has. But this is adipose tissue. And then, of course, there's a little bit of areolar, too. That's areolar connective tissue in there. Now, that's a blood vessel. Any questions? Since we don't have lab today, will there still be a lab quiz 4? There will be a lab quiz 4. Lab quiz 4 is over histology. And it's what it is locations and functions. So remember I put into the assignments folder a a worksheet for you to use to learn the locations and functions. And so, not today, but probably tomorrow, I will post the answers to these. But it's much better if you do it yourself. And then as soon as the answers get posted, there'll also be a quiz that's posted. So Lab Quiz 4 is about locations and functions. Does that answer your question? Yeah, so the answers, is that what we're talking about, will be posted tomorrow? Yeah, sometime tomorrow. Any other questions? Okay, well, I guess that's where we'll stop for today. So, keratin related question. I've seen a few things on TV. People stuck at sea and they said their nails fell off after a day or two being in water. Yeah, that happens a lot, especially with like their toes. And the reason why is because even though keratin is a little bit waterproof, it's not fully waterproof. So if you go to a manicurist, they soak your fingers in a solution with soap and water and stuff to soften the keratin before they mess with it or trim it or whatever. And so when you do that over a long period of time, it becomes so soft that it's not very protective anymore. And if you damage it in any way by bumping it or whatever, you lose the connections between that and the finger or the toe, and so it actually will lift up or it can come off completely. That's because we weren't really designed to be in water. So even though we might spend a lot of time in water, we don't do it 24 hours a day. But anyway, that's what that is. Any other questions? Okay, so we'll stop there. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.